We are back with another episode with Will Remor. Thank you for dialing in. How's it going, mate?
Yeah, good, man. Really good. Good to be back here.
Good stuff. I didn't reach out to you, but dude, and I apologize for this. I was down in Melbourne for the weekend, but just had a full itinerary. And I know that, you know, you've got your international work and you travel, but you've settled down in Melbourne. So for any folks that are watching this that are down in Melbourne that are going to reach out, you know, we'll put your links in a little bit later on. But the weather was really nice down there compared to Sydney.
Was. Yeah. It was really nice. My wife says that every time that she goes up to Sydney lately, she's been going out like every pretty much every month, and she says like every single time it's raining, and it's not the reality here at all.
It's crazy because it's usually the other way around. I don't know what's changed, but we're under a new regime where Sydney's okay today. Actually, Sydney's got nice weather. It's sunny and stuff today. But yeah, Melbourne just turns it on after some crap in Sydney. But you know, regardless of the weather, there's just a whole lot of like really valuable stuff that you've got going on. We mentioned, and I think people didn't know this, that RWA is not a new concept. You know, it is something that had been thought about from the early days of blockchain technology. And it was it 2019 that you were saying that Maker?
Yeah, it was at the end of 2019 that Maker started looking into it in that previous generation of RWA tokens, or the like first generation of it. And it started, I guess, the story of RWAs and STOs actually go even further back to probably 2016, 2017. Some projects are already actually exploring it.
STOs, for folks that may not be aware of that, what does that stand for?
Security token offerings, which was essentially the original generation done by of STOs were done by a few banks, funds, and then also some new startups in the market that were doing particularly like the tokenization and looking at different tokenization frameworks for those. The vast majority of the all early tokenization frameworks, each one was actually trying to invent their own tokenization framework, to be honest. And it was, if you go down the time machine type of Ethereum improvement proposal, you're going to see a whole set, at least 10 to 15 different frameworks that have actually been proposed and passed on from back then that time of like 2016 to 2018 type of era. And to be honest, the vast majority of those are not the ones that actually are implemented today.
That is really interesting. And it was just like this trying to figure out like which standards are going to work. And even if some standard was good, unless it had the votes, it could have been a great proposal, but it just didn't have the backing. So there's a bit of like selling, you know, what could be useful there. But, you know, what was it like back then in terms of, because like right now let's think about RWA, real world asset tokenization. And a lot of the talk is around, we see a lot of things being tokenized, but the question marks around, well, is it actually valuable? Does it actually tie into legal recourse? Are there legal contracts backing it? Is it like with tokenized stocks, is it just an IOU? Or is there actually something real? And I'm not saying that it's wrong to just like even just do that first step to tokenize. That's the first step, but it's like there's more that goes beyond that. But yeah, what was it like? That's what we're talking about these days. But what were the things that was being spoken about then? You mentioned all these different standards. Was standards the key?
Were a lot of like the different projects that I think we covered it briefly in our previous conversation, like the likes of, you know, Polymath, Polymesh, T0, and others. Each of them actually were proposing standards and then looking at different counterparties that saw value in tokenizing some of their underlying assets to launch into the market based on those specific standards, right? There was kind of like in that previous generation, again, more than 10 or so different standards of those. A lot of that actually didn't fly, didn't take up. The market didn't grow. The market was actually very, I guess, too early for it. A lot of what we call now, I guess, DeFi high liquid markets didn't exist, right? So it was maybe a little bit too early in terms if you think from the point of view of like market infrastructure and capital, and like market infrastructure is essential for capital formation across any asset. And in this case here, like the market was just not available, right? So all that what we call today like DeFi primitives, they didn't exist at that point in time. So it was mostly about like, oh, let's tokenize for the sake of tokenizing, for the sake of actually having things on chain. But as everything, as you know, once things actually on chain, people are not nowadays. It's very clear across the DeFi ecosystem. People are not only kind of like willing to put things on chain on the primary market and then having kind of like an OTC type of relationship on the primary market, and that's it. That's all that they're going to do. They want actually to put things on chain. For what? What is it that actually I gain relative to what is actually happening off chain? If all that I have is a primary market issuance and primary market redemption, sometimes actually the value of putting things on chain is just not there, right? So, and that's where I guess this second iteration, third iteration that we are living now today is building things on a completely different market infrastructure that is on top. And that's why I think it is one of the components that is making this iteration a little bit more successful. Again, let's to be honest here, we fully perfectly honest here, it's going towards success. It hasn't succeeded yet, right? Just to be bluntly clear, I think that's the direction of travel, is that it's going to be successful because the market infrastructure underlying on-chain markets globally is already there, but we'll take some bumps along the road. There will probably 100%, I think it will be market failures along the road as well. But I think now the direction of travel is much more clear than it was back in that first generation of STOs.
Yeah, I agree. I think we built on the backs of giants, standing on the shoulders of giants, whatever the saying is. These things, they're not just successful now. And I think this is what I want people to realize, that there were these, whether it's figuring out the standards and other, things that will work and not work, but it's also like all the lessons that come from that. What do you think makes a really good, just given all that you know now, like hindsight is 2020, which is great. But what do you think it takes to make a really great, you said like we're on the path to success. What does success look like for an RWA project of any sort?
Okay, so I think the market is definitely converging more onto a couple of standards in terms of like RWA issuance on the primary market, and then things that are actually happening on the secondary market are, I guess, driving the flywheel of some of that success, to be honest. So the primary on the primary market now, you have, of course, the typical ERC20 free flowing kind of like token that is the most widely used is standard for Ethereum and all the chains as well across the ecosystem. And there are RWAs that have been issued as pure play kind of RWA permissionless tokens or with allow lists. You have a little bit more, maybe more ring fenced, regulated standard that has been driven particularly by the Tokenisation that has recently been acquired by Apex Group, which is the 3643 standard that is essentially was created with a view of giving different kind of identifying different stakeholders in a kind of like in an RWA life cycle, an asset management cycle of an RWA, and giving them particular functionalities. And I think there's been quite a few market operators that actually are building on that standard, but that standard is still to a large proportion of it haven't been completely plugged into the market infrastructure that I was talking about, the DeFi markets. Not yet. But a lot of people have done issuance using that standard. And then there's a more, kind of like in between the two standards that are actually being used, which is the tokenized vaults standards, which is being particularly used for funds in the fund management industry, where essentially kind of like allows for yield-bearing tokens to be traded traded in the market. That's 4626 standard, which is essentially yield-bearing assets that can be traded and essentially kind of like operate a little bit like as an evolution of an ERC-20, right? And allows for example, like fund shares and fund units actually to be used. This is right now the most prevalent of all the RWA standards actually in the market today. And this is the one that has also been plugged in more easily into DeFi because it's ERC-20 compatible, even though it's like an evolution of it because that allows for that token shares, if you will. And then is also being used not only for token shares, it's being used but for most yield-bearing tokens across the ecosystem, right? So you see a lot of DeFi markets already kind of like integrating in that. And there's an evolution of that standard that I was just covering now, which is 7540, which is essentially the standard that has allowed for a synchronicity of the token itself. So for example, like sometimes there is a delay in terms of like it's non-atomic transactions between an operator utilizing the standard and the delay, particularly with the banking counterparty, but the custody counterparty, which allow for asynchronicity of the transaction, right? So that's more like an extension of that yield-bearing tokenized asset standard. And that one is the one that is being kind of like used by some folks that recognize that sometimes the delay is not necessarily on the activity that is happening on chain, but particularly on the activity in the markets operating off chain, and therefore allow a delay in transactions without the the general atomicity that you have on ERC-20 kind of like type of transactions.
I think it's really interesting that these things are being created. It's we're fast tracking innovation here. We're fast tracking how quickly we are able to test transactions that are of significant value, or like things that just couldn't be done before because we've got programmability. But then it has to interact with the real world. So it's not until you actually test these things in the real world and you come up with, we can envisage what the problem was that people saw that led to the creation of this 7540 ERP. This is just going to continue, right? Like we're going to continue and shape how RWA works for different industries, like whether it's real estate or it's carbon credits or it's like something else. Even the tokenization of things that just were, making it tokenizable so that now you can give access to people that wouldn't have had access to, say, for example, fixed income, and the whole securitization kind of process that we're seeing as part of our not centralized project for Project Acacia and the other 24 pilots and proof of concepts. But what are the interesting things that you're seeing being tokenized? Like you're at the coalface, and not only just some people like myself, we're newer to this, but you've seen it over time. Whether it was something that was looked at back a few years ago or something that you're seeing more recently now, what are some of the interesting things being tokenized?
There's all sorts of crazy experiments, to be honest, that have happened, and I've seen probably like some of the craziest ones that I've seen in the early days that, of course, they haven't realized because I don't even know if there is actually a on-chain market ready for it. But I've seen people tokenizing like things like Rolex watches for trading value, maybe kind of like some limited limited editions of some Rolex watches that they would like actually to use as on-chain collateral across lending markets, for example. Another one that is probably out there and definitely a few years away from some sort of like realization in mass is people tokenizing things like the specific chemical components in the production of wine. So, for example, trying to reverse engineer kind of a specific type of cepage or in a wine production, and then saying this is absolutely unique. So, for example, like a Chateau Lafite or some like high-end wine that costs, you know, hundreds of dollars and not hundreds of thousands of dollars actually a bottle, and trying to reverse engineer that molecule and the patent of that molecule and use that as collateral for trading in a kind of like as NFTs or that like in the trading markets. Of course, that kind of stuff is very exoteric, but I guarantee you, like just 3-4 years ago, people were coming to to protocols, where I was receiving some of those applications all over the place, and it was kind of like people were taking this absolutely seriously. Like, and it's like, okay, how do you create markets for these things on chain, where most of the traders in these markets were absolute degens, right? And who's gonna pay? Who's gonna provide market infrastructure, say like price discovery for things like this? It's very, very difficult to create markets for these exoteric products. But of course, I mean, all the way into the future, these are not necessarily the markets where the money flows are going, right? Definitely are not. A lot of it, the activity in the last few years has been very much in the highest liquid parts of the fixed income markets, because it's the biggest low hanging fruit, really.
I think low hanging fruit is definitely one thing. There's also these like so-called Arturo, my colleague that you know well here, and also co-founder of OzDeFi. He points out these dark markets, these markets where you may have, and I would argue this is kind of low hanging fruit because it's a market where it hasn't been digitized. There's a lot of like invoices or streaming of like revenue flows going through there. And it's either because it's inaccessible to retail traders, or it's just been not a non-digitized kind of market that could benefit from efficiency, or a mix of different things and components that lead it to being an attractive market to tokenize. If people are looking for, new things to tokenize, whether it's esoteric stuff like the patents for a chemical compounds, to do with the wine industry, what do you think makes a good kind of tokenization project? Like, if you were to look at it, I'm not saying from an investor lens and stuff, do your own research, folks. This is not investment advice, of course, but like, what makes something attractive to you? Because either you're interested in it, you want to work on that, or like, what makes something good in terms
of, I think the core I guess value proposition in terms of RWA markets that actually pay, not only myself but others actually pay attention to, are those that manage to transform liquidity from a highly illiquid off-chain market into a maybe more liquid or better liquid on-chain market. I think this is kind of like the optimum like the future, and one of the areas where I see that and that is increasing is definitely on the private credit space. There is a significant amount of hedge funds and shadow bank operators that actually are operating now in the private credit sphere, where, of course, because of all of the post-GFC regulations, traditional commercial banks actually couldn't operate, either because there was actually too much risk, or their risk-weighted assets in other Basel multiple iterations kind of like frameworks actually prevented them actually from going that way. So that has been taken by private lenders in the private credit markets. And a lot of those actually have essentially higher lockups, higher lockups, potentially some duration risks associated with some of those lockups, and a lot of private credit operators are actually looking for ways in the blockchain space to essentially kind of like, what if we could do some sort of like liquidity transformation alongside with like the DeFi markets, that we could actually make this asset class a little bit more liquid, so actually I can attract more flow, even if they are forfeiting away some of the yields on that primary market, but actually transforming this in actually being more liquid. There is a big portion, because I mean, people don't realize it, but the private credit market now is close to $10 trillion globally. It's a huge market, and is only been growing because actually the compliance and regulatory burden on traditional brick and mortar commercial lenders is nowhere reducing. Like, there's a lot of people even kind of like starting to say like, hey, we have actually to change Basel III and Basel IV regulations, because traditional commercial lenders cannot lend with the, all of the restraints on capital requirements and risk-weighted assets, and the way that actually those risk-weighted assets are calculated. All of that market is being taken on by private credit. So definitely there's a lot of operators out there servicing this market, and a lot of them actually are starting to look into ways of bringing some of those assets into the blockchain world.
I love it. I think that there's that it's a good way to look at it, like, especially that it just makes you wonder, and maybe someone's done some researchers, as we said before, like you came from that quant space back in traditional banking. Before, we used to look at numbers all the time in research, whether it's the data side of things, if you're on the buy side or the sell side. But I just feel like there is this big move. Stable coins and RWA was a big topic. Private credit, like, definitely is this huge space, like liquidity there that could be unlocked if only it's sat on programmable money, is pretty massive. Tokenization makes a whole lot of sense. All the chaos that happened before of figuring out what standards were, of like how these things best work and interact, and all of the features that are necessary for a real kind of like good project. I think we will need to dive into more of this in some future episodes with you, Will. But mate, thank you so much for the valuable lessons here. I think people should get a lot of good takeaways from this. And we're going to be doing some more events down in Melbourne, man. So we'll have to come down and see you for Oz DeFi. For the work that we do there, and we'll have to get you up on stage, and we'll put people in touch with you. Links are in the show notes from the last episode, but just for this one, Will, thank you so much. We'll put your links down below, and if any people want to like reach out, they can do that.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks very much. And I hope people actually get some value out of some of these interactions. There's a lot more under the hood here that we could have covered. We haven't even actually touched on the things like BTC back lending and other areas of the RWA markets that we can probably go into, and also a little bit more into what is it that is actually happening under that DeFi ecosystem. Where is it that actually these RWAs are flowing into, and what is it actually happening across them, both from the spot as well as the futures market that's already happening. But anyways, I'll leave this as a teaser for a future conversation.
Perfect. No, that's good. I love it. You're already bleeding into what we will cover in like a future one. But BTC back, that is a massive part of what could be unlocked. We'll talk about all of that and more in a future episode. Thank you so much, Will.
Thanks, mate.
Tech is wild. and the future's untamed. Blockchain blazing, carving new lanes. AI whispers in a silicon scheme. Dreams coded deep in a mainframe dream. Algorithms dance on this digital dirt. Crypto's buzzing while the old rules hurt. From Sydney skies to the outback glow, emerging tech is the game we throw.